Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 10. County of Essex to wit, Sir Charles Sheridan, Knight. By virtue of a warrant under the hand and seal of Harry Hodson, Esquire, Her Majesty's Coroner for the County of Essex, you are hereby summoned to be and appear before him on Monday, the 12th day of May, at 12 o'clock precisely at the Coroner's Court, to be held at Live and Let Live, Lamb's Lane, Dedham. Then and there to give evidence on Her Majesty's behalf touching the death of Sergeant Arthur Oliver, Constable, Gallows Green, Essex. Herein fail not at your peril. The Live and Let Live, the only pub on Lamb's Lane, was a little bigger than a cottage. Its low-ceilinged main room, beams blackened with smoke, was crowded with farmers and villagers jammed against the walls, and the long wooden counter that usually served as a bar. Both windows were open, so that the sound of the lane, the baaing of a passing flock of sheep, the roll of wheels and the clatter of hooves, were mixed with the indoor drone of voices and punctuated by the occasional loud remark. But the sweet May air could hardly contend with the overpowering scents of sweat and horse and leather jerkin. At the farther end of the room was a small trestle table like a desk, and behind it a scarred oak armchair. This seat was reserved for Coroner Harry Hodson, and at one end of the table was a stool for the clerk, with paper, pen, and ink, and blotting paper. At the other end was a chair for witnesses. Directly in front of the table, on the plank floor, was a closed pine coffin. Two long benches were arranged at right angles to the coffin for the jurors who, after some commotion at the door and shouts of "Let 'em pass, by God, so they can earn their 2 shillings," were ushered through the crowd to take their seats. At 2 shillings the jurors were not overcompensated for their work, for their attendance could be enforced for the entire day, if need be. Still, the event gave the day distinction, and those summoned were willing to spend it serving the Queen and her coroner. It was into this gloomy cave that Charles Sheridan made his way, carrying a leather portfolio. He paused to let his vision adjust from the noonday glare to the inner darkness, and then pushed forward through the crowd until he found a place to stand not far from the coroner's table. He caught sight of Edward Lakin leaning against the opposite wall, and waved a greeting, thinking that Edward looked pinched and pale and unhappy. Arthur Oliver had been a good friend. A moment later, a wisp of a man came through the rear door, perched on the stool like an eager bird, and shouted, "Gentlemen, the coroner!" Anybody who was sitting down stood up until Harry Hodson, who had nearly doubled in girth since Charles last had seen him 20 years before, took his seat with due ceremony in the chair of honour, and nodded to the clerk to proceed. The room then became silent, and the wispy man began to recite in rapid sing-song, "Ye good men of this district summoned to appear here this day to inquire for Her Sovereign Majesty the Queen when, how, and by what means Arthur Oliver, Sergeant of the Essex Constabulary, came to his death. Answer to your names as you shall be called, every man at the first call, upon the pain and peril that shall fall thereon." That done, the coroner read from his list the names of jurors, each one answering with a "Present, sir," meekly, assertively, or according to his temperament. Then followed the administering of the oath, in which the jurors promised to render a true verdict without fear or favour, affection, or ill will, to the best of their skill and knowledge, so help them God. The oath taken, the coroner told the jurors that they were to consider 3 possibilities: homicide, suicide, or misadventure, and if they were not satisfied that the evidence warranted any of these, they must return an open verdict. The coffin lid was then raised, and the jurors filed soberly past it, and once again resumed their benches. The coffin was closed, and the inquest began. "Lawrence Black," the coroner called. Charles leaned against the wall as Lawrence, splendid in yellow checkered trousers and visibly impressed by his importance in these court proceedings, took the oath, kissed the testament, and began, in response to the coroner's question, to relate his discovery of Artie Oliver's body. Everything went as Charles might have expected until the coroner said, I understand you were not alone when you discovered the body, Mr. Black. Lawrence's handsome face, which to this point had been animated, went blank. Sir, he said, I understand, the coroner repeated patiently, that you were accompanied through the hedge by a certain young woman. Is this true? A titter ran from one side of the room to the other. Lawrence turned to Edward. Do I have to answer? He asked in a loud whisper. Edward stepped forward, leaned over the table. If you don't mind, Harry, he said quietly, it'd be best for the girl if she was left out of this. I've questioned her and she can offer nothing new. Her testimony would simply corroborate Mr. Black's. Disregard the question, the coroner said, and a disappointed sigh followed the titter around the room. Lawrence Black was excused and stepped down to be followed by the police surgeon, who reported that death had resulted from a bullet being fired from a revolver right into the heart. It was at close range, he added. He had ascertained this fact from powder burns on the uniform jacket entered now in evidence along with the fatal bullet. Edward was called next. He filled Lawrence's rather vague description of the location of the body with a more careful account, and offered the speculation that Sergeant Oliver had been killed elsewhere and the body conveyed to the site by a vehicle along the adjacent lane, and then through a gap in the hedge. From Edward, the jurors also learned that the victim was 32 years old, married, with one young daughter, Betsy, and a wife, Agnes. Oliver had served with distinction in the Suffolk parish of East Berkholt before being promoted to sergeant and posted to Gallows Green. When Edward had completed his testimony, Charles was called. I understand, Sir Charles, the coroner said when the oath had been administered and Charles was seated in the witness chair, that you are a photographer. I am, Charles agreed. And that on the day in question you received a summons from Constable Lakin to photograph the dead body of Constable Oliver at the place where it was found. I did, Charles said. If it pleased the court, I have brought enlargements of the photographs with me. There was a curious stir in the room as he took the prints out of his leather portfolio and offered them to the coroner. For the past 20 years or so in England, photographs had been used in an attempt to identify criminals with very limited success. Scotland Yard had 115,000 faces in its rogues gallery, but the collection was in chaos because of the criminal's tendency to give false names. No reliable means of matching a photograph to its real-life subject had yet been developed, and no other uses of the camera were officially contemplated. So it was that Charles' photographs were little more than objects of curiosity to Coroner Harry Hodson and his 12 jurors. Even so, they were passed around and examined and wondered at, as was the triangular piece of red cloth discovered in the hedge, and Mr. McGregor's coat, which Edward had brought forward and laid on the table. At that point, Sir Charles was excused, and Mr. McGregor, wearing a stiff suit of dark brown corduroy and a red and yellow neckerchief knotted onto his hair, was summoned and sworn. His testimony was listened to with interest, but proved to be of little consequence. That the triangular cloth had been ripped from his coat was clear, but it was, after all, his hedge, and any fool knew that a man went through his own hedge a dozen times a week. Mr. McGregor's wife's brother's missing pistol was mentioned but not pursued, the police surgeon having determined from the shape of the recovered bullet that it could not have come from a weapon of that type. In answer to the question of whether he had noticed anything suspicious in the neighbourhood, Mr. McGregor offered the same opinion he had offered to Charles and Edward, with a slight but significant variation. "There's something suspicious going on," he rasped. "Sheep going missing, poachers, gypsies in the Vale." "Gypsies?" the coroner asked sharply. "When was this?" "Last week. 2 cabbages and a cauliflower was took from your garden, Mrs. McGregor's apron and a sheet off the line." "And you think these gypsies might have been responsible?" "'Tweren't rabbits," Mr. McGregor replied smartly, and was rewarded with a laugh. But as to whether gypsies might have murdered the constable, he declined to say, nor could he offer any other helpful information. He was dismissed with thanks. Charles, thinking the inquest at an end, turned to make his way in Edward's direction, when the coroner raised his voice once more. "Superintendent Hacking," he called over the murmuring and rustle. There was a silence, and through the crowd came a stocky, distinguished-looking man in the uniform of the constabulary. He went to the witness chair and was sworn and sat down. The man's grey hair and mustache was luxuriant, his boots were polished, and several decorations glittered on the pocket of his impeccably pressed serge jacket. Altogether, he was an impressive-looking witness. Charles looked at Edward and raised his eyebrows, curious as to why a superintendent had been called. Edward answered with a shrug. Apparently it was a surprise to him too, which in itself was odd, considering that the murder, which had been committed in Edward's district, was Edward's case. Superintendent Hacking was stationed at a district headquarters nearby Colchester, began with a brief summary of Sergeant Oliver's service, and reported that the standing joint committee that controlled the county force had met upon the matter and determined that the sergeant had met his death while in the execution of his duty. Mrs. Oliver had been granted pension of £15 a year, plus £2.10 for the child. The questioning then turned to the incident itself. "Do you know," Harry Hodson asked, "why Sergeant Oliver might have been in the vicinity of Dedham on the night he was murdered?" Hacking's face was impassive. "I do," he said. "Please state it for the jury." "There was a matter that required the urgent attention of police in the neighborhood." Hacking's voice was clipped. "If you press me, I will state it, but in the interest of justice, it would possibly be best not to." Charles frowned. This was an odd business. Several of the jurors apparently thought so too, for they sat forward on their bench. Edward was even more intent, his face furrowed, lips pressed together. "You may state the reason," Coroner Hodson says. Hacking's eyes flicked to Edward. "Sheep had been stolen in the neighborhood," he said. "In consequence, close attention was being paid, by my special direction, I might add." Edward sat upright. Harry Hodson frowned. "No one has offered any evidence suggesting that the murder involved sheep stealing." "The preceding witness did," the superintendent replied. The clerk was consulted. Mr. McGregor's testimony was read back, and the superintendent's recollection was in fact confirmed. But when asked to specify whose sheep had been taken, the superintendent only replied that this was the very information Sergeant Oliver had been attempting to procure, so he was no wiser than any of them. However, Chief Constable Pell had taken the case himself and expected it to speedily be resolved. Mr. McGregor was recalled from the bench outside the pub, where he was sharing a pint with a friend, and asked for more specifics about sheep stealing, but he could provide nothing more and was permitted to return to his pint. The jury retired to the back garden and returned a few moments later with the verdict everyone had expected. Homicide by person or persons unknown. People stirred, voices were raised. Sanders the publican opened the tap, and life at the Live and Let Live began to flow again.